I want to thank everyone who put this together. It's an enormous enterprise, and you've done it beautifully. Thanks so much. You've got a rich buffet for us all. I wrote my speech because I'm Irish and an Aquarian, and if you give me your attention on microphone, I will launch into a digression immediately. So in order to keep focused, I've got this written down. I was very much admiring Ravi over the last 2 days and how he's able to keep on target while being extemporaneous, but I'm afraid I can't do that. I'm a little bit cheating here because this is not quantum. This is going to be Newtonian science. Some of you will know the two theories I'm going to talk about. So for you who do, sensitive dependence on initial condition and fractal geometry, it'll be a review. For the others, I just want to make sure we're all up to speed. When I first started writing Dancing with Chaos, I thought of it as it's hard to express physics without mathematics, so I would make it easy for people by putting it into poetry, thereby forgetting that Americans are more frightened of poetry than they are of physics. So I've since found that it's actually, I have to apologize for the physics. I mean, for the poetry rather than for the physics. So, chaos. What is it that makes that scientific theory sound so much more exciting than, say, Bell's theorem? Once you get to know it, Bell's theorem is really interesting, but it doesn't seem to have caught the public eye quite the way chaos theory has. If chaos theory is sexy, well, Bell's theorem has a good personality. More than any other concept in contemporary physics, chaos catches our attention because it sounds exciting, daring, maybe a little dangerous. When we call it by its more exact scientific names, dynamical systems theory or the science of complexity, chaos loses some of its edge. Because the word chaos itself has power. It sums up primeval flux, the power of the yet unformed universe. It's a word we use in everyday life. Oh God, my life is just in chaos these days, we say, or clean up that chaos in your room or you'll hear from me. In such moments, what we really mean are that things are in disorder. But that's not what scientists mean by the word. In science, chaos embraces both disorder and order. The word describes what I like to call a dance between these two poles, for like the dance, the essence of chaos is movement rather than stasis. In the next little while, I want to show how some concepts from the science of chaos can illuminate the spiritual enterprise. First, I want to read a list of the lessons that chaos theory has taught me. Then I'll discuss the scientific concepts that support those theories. In several cases, I will read a poem, don't leave, to illustrate the concept, because as a poet, I've found that the language of images and rhythms helps me connect with science. I'm sure there are others here who don't speak fluent math, and I hope the images will help you interpret the mathematics of the theories. So here are the spiritual lessons that I believe chaos holds. Number 1, perfection is impossible. 2, change is the only thing that does not change. Its corollary, change is not failure. 3, even the smallest efforts are worthwhile. Corollary, details are not small matters. 4, we may never understand the whole pattern. 5, we may be pulled by more than one attractor. 6, complex is not the same as complicated. And finally, the most creative solutions come at the edge of chaos. Corollary, risk is impossible to avoid. To understand the source of these insights, I want to introduce 2 important concepts from chaos theory. I begin with sensitive dependence upon initial condition, also called the butterfly effect, or as I have dubbed it in the following poem, the butterfly tattoo effect. The first poem. Its epigram is a line from Edward Lorenz. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? Which you may have also heard. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Japan set off a tornado in Nebraska or something? It's many forms of that phrase. Charlene was 50 when she got it. One small butterfly perched on her right shoulder, bright blue with stipples of pink. Everything in her life seemed safe by then. Husband, children, house, and dog. She wanted to be a little dangerous. When she left the Jade Dragon, she called her oldest friend. Maggie in Florida with the news. A tattooed gal at 50, she bragged. I ain't down yet. Maggie laughed that throaty laugh of hers. An hour later, on her way to work, she stopped on a whim and bought a gallon of paint for her door. That night, she didn't drive straight home, but stopped at a drink from an old haunt from her more dangerous years. No one she knew was there, so she talked a while to Flo, the bartender. Told her about feng shui and red doors, and oh yes, she mentioned the tattoo just before she left. It rested in Flo's mind all night as she uncapped the beers and mixed the drinks. She was warmer than usual, sassy and loud. Things got wild. There was dancing. A new woman stopped in and picked up one of the regulars. Washing up past midnight, Flo thought of her old friend Paula, who lived in California. It was still early there. Flo picked up the phone right there and called. Somehow the subject of Charlene's tattoos came up. Paula had been thinking of getting one too. Why not? Life marks us all. Why can't we choose our scars just once? They talked till late. The next day, Paula walked into a dealership and bought the reddest car she saw. By nightfall, she was driving fast toward the sea. And the next morning, the world awoke to news of seismic convulsions on every continent brought on by the simultaneous shifting into high gear of millions of women in bright red cars. So watch it, you tattooed ladies. To understand sensitive dependence, you have to hark back to the simpler days when Newton's physics gave us the perhaps overweening confidence that if we knew the original position of a moving object and the force and angle at which it was hit, we could trace its trajectory and find out where it would land. The formulae were good enough for baseball, Newton's apple, etc. So it seemed to scientists in the pre-chaos period that given enough information, say where every subatomic particle was at the Big Bang, we would know the future simply by doing the math. Then in the 1960s came Edward Norton Lorenz. In order to explain Lorenz and the butterfly effect, I'm going to have to go back further in time and tell you about the three-body problem, first articulated in the 19th century. And to begin to explain this, I have to turn to another poem. Let me first set the stage. It's the late 1800s, and physicists like Lord Kelvin are complacent in believing that their science has figured out most things. There was a cloud on the clear horizon, though, and that was that no one had yet figured out the mathematics of how three bodies interact. So King Oscar II of Sweden announced a prize for the person who could solve the problem, which was stated thus. Given a system of arbitrarily many mass points that attract each other according to Newton's law, under the assumption that no two points ever collide, try to find a representation of the coordinates of each point as a series and a variable that is some known function of time, and for all of whose values the series converges uniformly. That's a mouthful. The best solution was offered by the French scientist Henri Poincaré, who said of his prize-winning formula, "These things are so strange, I cannot bear to contemplate them." What was it that he found? Let me describe it in a poem. I want to say, too, that Dancing with Chaos, since ultimately the greatest chaos for most of us is relationship, I invented a framework of rigid order in the first section, a relationship that's dying, catastrophic dissolution, love poems, in the second, and then reemergent order in the last. So it's not me in these poems, it's the invented narrator. But the three-body problem, when I thought of it, I thought, well, that's sort of obvious. It was easy to figure out when there were just two, me, you. Easy, remember? The route between us, always starting here, ending there, me to you. Never the other way, starting there, ending here. Pattern set, route established. We knew what to expect, how to act. We thought we knew everything about the future. The future. It would be the same, route set, pattern established. We knew how everything moved, me to you, one of us a satellite and one a sun, one peripheral to the other's center. Me drawing the same circles around you over and over. Easy. Then suddenly, as we were looping our usual loop, me to you, suddenly there was the other. A new body, a third, me, you, the other. What would we do now? Where were the centers? How would the circles be drawn? Who was to move how? Two bodies, then a third. This could have been many stories, even one as simple as two friends having coffee one morning who make space for someone to join them, after which their conversation falters. Each of us has many such stories. Two bodies, then a third. And everything is different after that. This is one of those stories. This is the story in which the third body is one with arms that reach and hold, eyes that gleam and smile, a body with all the parts a body needs to come between two other bodies. That story. No one can predict what will happen when a third body joins a two-body system. Linear equations are useless. One thing is certain, things will change. We could not go on as before, just another loop added, once an opening had been made for chaos. When three bodies interact, everything becomes important. Huge changes are caused by the tiniest gestures, a glance, a whisper, the touch of fingertips on the inside of a wrist. Two bodies, then a third, and everything is different after that. Everything was different after Poincaré. He pointed out that linear equations are simply not up to the job of solving three-body problems. But there was something that could, nonlinear equations. Unfortunately, these were virtually unsolvable at the time. There were simply not enough years in a lifetime to do the math. For a wonderful artistic interpretation of this, I encourage you to read or see Tom Stoppard's wonderful play Arcadia, one of the most eloquent literary works inspired by chaos. The playwright imagines a young girl so brilliant that she figured out that the secret to chaos rests in nonlinear equations. But dying in a fire before she could figure out even one such equation left a haunted tutor still infatuated with her to go crazy trying to finish her work. Then came the computer. Even early ones brought us enough computational power to solve a simple nonlinear equation, the kind that would have taken a human lifetime to solve. This is where Lorentz comes in. In the 1960s, when he was a meteorologist at MIT, Lorentz was running some models of the Earth's atmosphere. Imagine the scene, a big old computer, the kind that used key punch cards. We know how old you are now. If you know what that means. The kind that took up a whole room and created not beautiful graphic models, but lists of equations and formulae. But even with that clumsy machine, scientists for the first time could see what would happen when multiple factors were at work. Weather researchers love this because weather is, of course, formed by many factors, including air temperature, wind speed, moisture, and other variables. Each time Lorentz plugged in his data and ran the program, the same answer came out. That left him puzzled. Why then was weather so unpredictable? The answer came to him by chance. One day when the machine's printer jammed, Conrad reloaded it and started the data run again. But instead of starting at the beginning, he picked up in the middle, rounding the figures off to 3 decimal points rather than the previous 6. When the program had run its course, the results were entirely different from what they had been every time before. Imagine expecting a hurricane and getting a balmy wind, or the other way around. All this from 3 decimal points? What Lorentz had discovered was that, indeed, we can calculate even nonlinear equations precisely if we have precise enough data. But the slightest change in the input, and I mean the most minute change, can change the outcome drastically. Iterated through a system, any action can create more than its equal and opposite reaction, as Newton said. Even a tiny action can create a major upheaval. Iteration is easy to understand if you have a credit card. Just notice that interest iterating itself monthly causes your bill to swell and grow. In the same way, a small change in the form of, say, a minor alteration in ocean temperature can be iterated to bring global bankruptcy. Lorentz called this the butterfly effect, possibly inspired by a Ray Bradbury story popular at the time, in which a time traveler, ignoring the rule not to step off the moving pathway, crushes a butterfly and comes back to an entirely changed future. I've not been able to either confirm or deny the report that that was the basis of the name. It's the same thing I spoke of in the butterfly tattoo effect in the poem I just read. Sensitive dependence upon initial conditions means that very tiny causes can have very large effects. And those effects are unpredictable, as experiments with sand show. The following poem was inspired by one of these experiments. Sand sifts down, 1 grain at a time, forming a tiny hill. When it grows high enough, a tiny avalanche begins. Let sand continue to sift down, and avalanches will occur irregularly in no predictable order until there is a mountain range of sand. Peaks will appear and valleys, and as sand continues to descend, the relentless sand piling up and slipping down, piling up and slipping down, piling up. Eventually, 1 grain will cause a catastrophe. All the hills and valleys erased, the whole face of the landscape changed in an instant. Walking yesterday, my heels crushed chamomile and released intoxicating memories of home. Earlier this week, I wrote an old love, flooded with need and desire. Last month, I planted new flowers in an old garden bed. One grain at a time, a pattern is formed. One grain at a time, a pattern is destroyed. And there is no way to know which grain will build the tiny mountain higher, which grain will tilt the mountain into avalanche, whether the avalanche will be small or catastrophic, enormous or inconsequential. We are always dancing with chaos, even when we believe we move too gracefully to disrupt anything in the careful order of our lives, even when we deny the choreography of passion, hoping to avoid earthquakes and avalanches, turbulence and elemental violence and pain. We are always dancing with chaos, for the grains sift down upon the landscape of our lives, one then another, one then another, one then another. Sensitive dependence upon initial conditions did not displace Newtonian physics. This is different, I must emphasize, from quantum uncertainty, which is a conversation for another time. Uncertainty and the Heisenberg principle and so forth are not yet connected with chaos. I look forward to that day. Chaos theory says we could calculate the trajectory of a baseball's arc through the air, provided we know the exact location of every atom at the beginning of that arc. But exact turns out to be a very hard thing to determine. Even the slightest difference between the angle of a pitcher's arm between one pitch and another makes all the difference in the world as to where the ball lands. Life is not wildly unpredictable. It is just very, very, very hard to measure. The second concept from chaos theory I want to introduce is fractal geometry. To understand fractals, you have to go back to in your imagination to geometry class in high school. Headaches are setting in. Remember learning all those figures, the parallelogram, the dodecahedron, how to find their area and mass and all that? This was Euclid's geometry, which had been in use for over 2,500 years without anybody questioning it. It seemed to work, just as the idea of knowing the future by measuring the past had seemed to work. Along came a brilliant and somewhat eccentric man. To this day, for example, he claims not to know the alphabet. The Polish-born French mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot. For the first time in several millennium, a geometrically trained mind looked at the world afresh and saw something other than the expected squares and circles. Beginning in the late 50s and continuing through the 1980s, Mandelbrot saw that the world was far less regular than parallelograms and dodecahedrons might suggest. A lot, he realized, had to do with scale. The sun is a sphere only when viewed from a long distance. Closer up, it has all sorts of bumpy things jutting out of it. All of the natural world is this way, fractured and fractioned, Mandelbrot said, coining in 1975 the word fractal to describe an irregular but predictable geometry. The regularity of Mandelbrot's geometry is the regularity of scale rather than shape. It's called self-similarity. To understand this concept, you need only look at a tree. Better yet, look at two distinct trees standing side by side. In Chicago, I would say take a sycamore and an oak, but let me here suggest an acacia and a eucalyptus. You will notice that a certain angle is repeated in each of the branches. The larger branches come out at that angle, then the smaller branches come out at that angle, until if you pick a leaf, you will find the angle repeated again in how the veins come out from the central leaf. Look at one tree standing next to our other tree, and you will see a completely different angle repeating and repeating and repeating. The angle is never exactly the same. It iterates itself rather than being identical. Self-similarity is this continuing iteration at various scales, the same pattern appearing in miniature that we find much larger in the tree or glacier or mudslide. For not only biological entities have fractal geometry, we find it in the stars as well. Natural fractals are now commonplace on calendars and posters, for they are innately pleasing to the human eye. But these fractals are also found in mathematics itself. Supercomputers can now create colored images of equations which show them to be as intricately self-similar as organic natural forms. Here I want to recommend that marvelously titled digital artwork called Mathematics for Lovers from Cornell University Computer Lab. Speaking of lovers, let's read another poem. the fractal geometry of love. Starts with a quote from Mandelbrot. Clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and bark is not smooth, nor does lightning travel in a straight line. Number 1, iteration. There is a kind of hunger which satisfaction intensifies. I touch you again and again and again, and with each touch, I want to touch you more. I'm caught in a feedback loop of touching and touching and touching and touching. Self-similarity. The smallest gesture is the same as the largest. When you placed your hand on mine in that cafe, it was the same as when you placed your hand on mine in bed. And when you looked into my eyes for a flashing instant, it is the same as when you hold them until we both burst into flame. Measurement. The eye is not a sphere. My breasts are not circles. Your nipples are not circles. Your face is not smooth, and nothing between us travels in a straight line. If I were to attempt to outline your sweet body, I would be unable to do so. If I touch it closely enough, so closely that I trace each cell's boundary, each cell's connection to other cells, I would be measuring your outline until the end of time. And that is what I'm doing here, lying here next to you in the sun, trying to move beyond time, imagining my journey to the infinite, my hand slowly, slowly, slowly tracing the vast outline of your body. The next poem is going to take quite a bit of setup. It describes the various features of the mathematical set named for Mandelbrot. You might have seen it. If you haven't, you would see a couple of black bulbs with irregular surfaces around which spiral intensely complicated, beautifully organic shapes. A pixel is colored in black when the nonlinear equation it represents tends toward a certain attracting point. And here we are delving into the truly mathematical aspect of mathematics. For these equations can find their way home, we might say, to a certain number or a set of numbers, no matter what numbers are plugged into the equation at first. So, plug in 121 and 12, and a certain equation will find its way to an attracting point, say 20. Plug in 200 and 125 into the same equation, and it will settle down to 20. It's truly unsettling to watch this happen, to watch the consistency with which numbers will find their way to their attracting points. Back to the Mandelbrot set. The dark areas of the equation are the equations that have fixed attracting points, and there can be anywhere from 1 to 5 normally. But around them swirl these amazing colored designs, which represent equations with no fixed attracting point. Rather than settling down, the numbers generated by these equations spin out to infinity. They are color-coded by how quickly they escape to the unmeasurable, with the dark blues being slower to make that escape than the hot reds and yellows. Or is it possible that they have fixed attracting points, but there are so many points that it is impossible for the human mind to perceive the pattern? Let me give this to you in a poem. Hold in your mind the picture of these heart-shaped, dark shapes connected to another dark ball and surrounded by spinning colors. Mandelbrot set. Number 1, the heart. The dark interior of the heart shatters in a certain way. It breaks in two and breaks again in two and breaks again in two and again, and ultimately disintegrates into dust, infinitely many particles in which each one is a tiny replica of the whole. 2, connecting circles. They look stable and firm. They look like they will withstand all dissolution. They look well matched. They look as though they are so content, so much at peace. Whatever seemed contained like that is something that refuses to escape to infinity. Invisible miniatures. In an ocean of chaos, seeds float like plankton. What whale feeds here? What porpoise? And the border. Here is where chaos starts. It is the fiercest hunger. It is a great tearing pain that so occupies the mind that there is nothing else. It is being breathed. It is being breathless. Standing on the border of chaos means standing in a sharp, cold wind on the highest pass in Arctic mountains. It means plunging into stars. It means soaring into jade seas. Here at the border, we are not in chaos yet. This is more relentless than chaos and more beautiful, far, far more beautiful. And then out at the edges in the chaotic regime. If order hides in the folds of apparent disorder, where is chaos hiding? At the furthest distance from order, when everything becomes infinite all at once, instantly, I am looking for chaos. And floating above it, at the greatest height, I can see a raven spread its wings and fly. Okay, if your head is not spinning sufficiently, let me add an extra dazzling theory. Lorentz discovered something he called the strange attractor. Most equations settle down into a pattern. Some equations settle down into a pattern, but the pattern changes. In other words, the fixed points might be 3, 4, 5, the first round, and 4, 5, 6, the second, and 5, 6, 7, the third. The pattern, when graphed out, looks like the face of a wise but stern owl. Some of you have seen the shape of chaos. It is from these parts of the theory, sensitive dependence upon initial conditions and fractal geometry, that I've derived my own life lessons of chaos. But before I go back to these lessons, I want to say a little bit about how I came to study chaos, how I, a poet and writer, came to study and teach in the sciences. This was not a complete change of career because I'd been a science writer for many years in my home state of Alaska, where I specialized in geophysics. But science was always a fairly distant intellectual enterprise, even during the period I was earning my doctorate in science and literature, studying connections between early quantum theory and the beginnings of now what we now call postmodern literary theory. It was the mid-90s, and suddenly my husband was diagnosed with cancer. I grew up in a family where chaos reigned. By that I actually mean disorder. My father was a decorated but deeply damaged veteran of the Korean War who brought the war home in his psyche in a way that will become familiar to thousands of families in the next decade and far beyond. I've recently written and published a book on the impact of war on my family because I believe that many people suffer as I did from the impact of wars brought home. Anyone who's grown up in a family with family violence knows how the psyche adapts to erratic parental behavior by investing heavily in attempts to control the environment. I was one of those people who had to have everything just right in order to feel safe enough to function. Then came cancer. Those of you who have lived with life-threatening illnesses now know how all-consuming the search for healing becomes. I was blessed in having a strong and unconflicted relationship with my husband, the novelist Bob Shea, who accepted cancer as a spiritual discipline. The secret of happiness, he told me once, is to live like you have cancer, but not actually have cancer. I try to live by that. For me, having life spiral out of control was more terrifying than anything I have ever experienced. And then when Bob died, I experienced a spiritual void such as I have never known. I've written about this at some length in the essay Physics and Grief, and of the strange incidents that accompanied my journey through that dark landscape. I won't repeat the full story here, but I will say I did not go willingly into the study of chaos. I resisted because I feared that chaos meant the end of any order in my life. Like most of us in Western society today, my ideas were unconsciously impacted by dualism. Much of that derives from the work of the African philosopher Augustine of Hippo, who changed little of his philosophy when he changed his allegiance from Persian Manichaeism to Christianity in the early 4th century. Following his lead, our culture tends to describe things as opposites, where other cultures have seen polarities or continuums. In Japanese Shinto, for example, good and evil are not opposite. Evil, represented by the storm god Susanoo, is whatever is out of place, out of bounds. In fact, our own language hides a similar spiritual truth. Our word evil derives from the word full. It's eful. Eful is anything that is excessive, beyond natural boundaries. Good, by contrast, derives from words that mean to bond together. Augustine in his law told us the soul and the body were separate and at war. This is a pernicious but persistent lie. Other opposites followed, among them men versus women, head versus heart, and yes, order versus chaos. We have inherited this dualism from our philosophic traditions. Some of this, yes, can be traced to Plato, whose ideal world of abstract perfection leaves almost everything in our real world looking pretty tattered and imperfect. and the geometry of Euclid and Pythagoras, both of whom imagined a world of perfect, unalterable forms, circles and triangles and squares, predictable and clear. Life isn't that way. Life is messy, erratic, and unpredictable. Life therefore, in that view, cannot be anything but deficient. And that's what the philosophy I had grown up with urged me to believe. So, confronted with the messy, chaotic process of cancer, I had no philosophy to help me understand. The New Age friends who told Bob that cancer was entirely in his control meant well, but they caused us untold pain. If Bob could have meditated his cancer away, he would be with us today. So there I was, struggling with the illness and death of my beloved husband, trying to piece together a life that made sense. Chaos came to the rescue. Here are some of the things it taught me. There is no such thing as perfection. When chaos scientists studied static in telephone lines, they found that there is a self-similar pattern. A burst of static has, they found, instants of silence within it. Conversely, what seem to be periods of silence enfold almost inaudible instants of static. While many spiritual traditions emphasize perfection, the point should be the effort, not the result. It is ultimately self-defeating to imagine one can be perfect. Nature is just not that way. Second, change is the only unchanging thing, and change is not failure. Our attempt to be perfect often stems from a belief that we should reach perfection, then stay there. If perfection were possible, it would not last. Change is even more certain than death and taxes. We might as well embrace it, although I admit that is the hardest lesson for me even today. Even the smallest efforts are worthwhile. Corollary: details are not small matters. Remember that butterfly causing storms with the beating of its wings? We can often feel hopeless when we look at the world around us. How can we ever affect change? How, for example, can we bring people together, as Theosophists have urged from the beginning, to create a caring world rather than one in which spirituality is a reason for warfare and torture? Can a few people in a room in Phoenix have any impact on this world? Yes, chaos theory tells us, but only through action. If the butterfly lies down and does not flap her wings, nothing will change. Okay, I'm going to allow myself a digression here. Possibly the most interesting lecture I've seen. I go to a fair number of chaos conferences as the writer in residence, and I saw a lecture last year in Kalamazoo. It's not published yet, by a scientist from either Antioch or Oberlin. I'm trying to track down the specifics. He asked himself the question of, are there any new systems? Is there anything actually new in the world? Or is everything just possibly inherent in a system but not yet revealed because circumstances hadn't been right for it? So he figured that one thing we could pretty well be sure of is that plants are not in any way adapted to permanent darkness. So if he could get plants to turn on the light, then he would know that that's not things that plants had embedded in their system for when it became necessary. So he took, I'm simplifying, kind of big vats of algae, and then he closed them up, and he rigged it so that if the algae emitted a sufficient amount of a certain enzyme, the light would come on, allowing the algae to, use the light. Oh, by the way, in the tanks were a lot of algae food, so they weren't in there starving. So. Lest you be concerned about the fate of the algae. So he found that, and then they had to stop emitting the enzyme in order to make the lights go off. So if you can imagine, the lights inside the tank are tied in by gauges to the enzymes emitted by the algae. It took about 2 weeks, and then the algae started turning the lights on and off. Folks, if algae can do it, I charge you, humans can do it. They settled down to a 27-hour day, which is interesting. And I asked him at dinner, I said, what did you do with the algae afterwards? He said, we put them back in the lake. I said, oh my God. They're out there teaching each other. no way that algae would have had, this was a real creative solution and a self-emergent solution. And it came from the algae working together. I keep pondering those algae. We may never understand the whole pattern. Remember those strange attractors and the possibility that apparently disordered things may conform to a pattern too vast for us to see? So it is with life. There may be patterns at work that we cannot see, that only an omniscient being would perceive. Like the impossibility of embracing change, this is another lesson with which I struggle constantly. We may be pulled by more than one attractor. Again, belief in perfection can lead us to think that contradiction is wrong, but we may be equally and reasonably pulled in different directions. Finding space for ambiguity and contradiction is an important spiritual discipline. Complex is not the same as complicated. These are different. Complicated means having one cause but many results. Complex means having many causes. Do not mistake them. Chaos is the science of complexity, but chaos can be very simple indeed. The most creative solutions come at the edge of chaos, and risk is impossible to avoid. One of the wonderful things about the Mandelbrot set is the way it illustrates the way rigid order and disorder are equally unproductive of creative change. The poised edge of chaos, which is the technical term, is the place where creative things happen. New forms emerge, new ideas are born. Only by dancing on that edge will we create the world that we all dream of living in. You might look at the work of the Santa Fe Institute and the science of complexity there. To conclude, in my own journey through chaos, I began in an emotional and intellectual place of dualism, which urged me to believe that when I was not in control, things were out of control. Chaos theory has helped me understand that I was never in control and that things will never be entirely out of control. I learned that we do not live in the perfection of abstraction, but in a pulsing, changeful world. Chaos has offered me a vocabulary and a conceptual framework for exploring ways of interpreting my life that fly in the face of Platonic, Manichaean, Augustinian dualism, that message from the past that kept me for so many years from truly embracing the flow of life. I want to end with a poem, two poems actually. The first is a found poem composed of actual questions from physics tests. One of the things I love about physics is it's really so poetic. The second, my own answers to those questions. So the first one is called Examination. It's got 10 questions, and I will pause so you can think about them. Number 1, describe disruption of laminar flow. 2, is uncertainty random? 3, are unpredictable instabilities chaotic? 4, distinguish between noise and chaos. My absolute favorite. 5, is chance further reducible? 6, are all attractors strange? You know the answer then. 7, draw a basin of attraction. 8, name a useful dissipative system. These are all from physics textbooks. Aren't they great? 9, can a stable equilibrium last? How turbulent is the heart? 1, describe disruption of laminar flow. In the wilderness between center and edge, the vortex is born. 2, is uncertainty random? Distinguish between not knowing and not knowing. 1 at the root of all. 1 an order so immense we would have to stand in another universe to glimpse its outline. Are unpredictable instabilities chaotic? Wait long enough. Distinguish between noise and chaos. A, distantly I hear water dropping onto porcelain. B, inside explosions are instants of silence. 5, is chance further reducible? The weakness of the theory, the constancy of chance, Einstein said, which does not get us any closer. 6, are all attractors strange? A boulder, 2 gold pins, 3 feathers, and then an owl flying away, flying far away. 7, draw a basin of attraction, my hands tracing the hollow of your throat. 8, name a useful dissipative system, abandoned to the dance. 9, can a stable equilibrium last? Instead, recurrence, never the same thing exactly, never exactly the same, but repeating the same thing, never exactly the same thing, but repeating, recurring, repeating. 10, how turbulent is the heart? As any instrument that translates noise, chaos into music, order. Thanks very much. Got lots of time for comments and questions.
I remind you to hold the mic close.
Patricia's very excited about her role at the Black Hawk Institute.
Black Earth.
Black Earth Institute. Black
Thanks.
Earth Institute. And I didn't mention it because she was so excited when she was talking to me about it. I want her to tell about Black Earth Institute. It's a think tank, but she doesn't like that word, so she'll explain that.
Thanks, Claire. I was telling Claire about this before we started. The work I'm doing right now is trying to look at the question of religion, which we really all need to be looking at these days in this world, and particularly the role of the arts in that area. Today in America, the arts are viewed as a route to celebrity, a route to money. It's all kind of part of the commercial enterprise. Historically, basically through time, the artist has been the one that stands at the edge of chaos and brings forth new knowledge for the community. It's a role found in every culture, as a shaman, making music and dancing the spirits, as a griot in Africa, telling the stories of the tribe, in the Celtic bardic tradition, which I could go on at great length about because it has to do with bringing down evil governments, but I won't bring that up. You can find out about it at the break. But in any case, the artist always had responsibility to the world as bringing forth a kind of knowledge. It was not just a matter of exploiting your life and getting a lot of money and going on Oprah. A couple of years ago, I was at a dinner in Ireland, at an Arts Week dinner, and somebody said something about the most powerful person in America, referring at the time to Bill Clinton. I said, "Oh, Oprah Winfrey." The fact is that we have to find some new vocabulary where the artist is connected rather than disconnected. This also has to do with science and the environment. When the artist sees the only subject as the self, that certainly limits us from looking at the world. Those of us who are on the borderlands of science and literature and so forth have a hard time even explaining what we do because we're supposed to be writing about ourselves. I was recently speaking at the University of Iowa where the lead speaker said, "Face it, there's really no subject but the self. You just ought to be a very interesting person to catch my attention." And I was horrified because the self is a limiting factor for the artist rather than an opening factor. The self is a route into things, but it isn't the end. So the Black Earth Institute was founded 2 years ago. We had our first gathering. What we did was gathered, basically invited like the 10 people we thought were doing the best work in this area. And we invited them to come and live with us for a week at our farm, which was fairly daring because We'd never done anything like that. There are fellows of the Institute, and it was the most amazing week I've ever spent. And when I go back, we'll be beginning the process over with gathering the group. The fellowship applications are going to be online momentarily if you know artists who are working in this area. And the next round of fellows will be appointed 2 years from this fall. So with applications due like next fall. So if you know people working in that area, I'd be happy to talk with people. But thanks for that opening. Not about chaos, but there is something chaotic about it. I remain constantly enamored of the way in which the vocabulary of chaos allows me to understand challenges that I face in life. I was actually thinking about it yesterday when they lost my luggage, which had all the copies of Dancing with Chaos, and I thought, okay, I still really think things ought to run, and I really am bothered by change. I have the same problems that any of us do, with disorder creeping in. But at least I now have a vocabulary for understanding that disorder is an opening as well as an opening and a challenge to us. If you think about housework, you can't ever have it perfectly clean, or if you do, a dog will walk through. And instead of thinking, oh, I've failed, instead, well, that's the beginning of it all over again. I think it was Jung said that every life has things that are questions and that really will never have an answer, that we keep going back to the same things and working on them. They're what we're here to work on. And seeing it as process rather than product, I think, is one of the big things, that it's about the continuing effort, the action, the process, rather than getting it right. We all know people who have got it right spiritually, and, they're very oppressive people. There's no dance involved, and they're clinging to it. And of course, life is going to shatter them, And I look to them and think, oh, you poor dear, what will you do when the challenge comes? Because the challenge will come. Life will present us with that challenge. And holding on to the rigid order is only a way of letting ourselves get, broken. And of course, then we try to reassemble it in exactly the same order and become even more rigid. So in Dancing with Chaos, we're working against that kind of intellectual, emotional, and religious rigidity that says, I got the way, and it's the way, and now we behead you or we convert you. The Irish are subtle that way. The experience of living part-time in Ireland for many years, there's lots of Catholics there who, worship at holy wells, which go back to the Neolithic. And, when asked about how they do that, they just go, what's the problem here? They're very non-dualistic. As one of the nuns who relit the fire of St. Bridget at Kildare said, when I said, well, wasn't she, the goddess Bridget? She says, wasn't she a goddess before ever she was a saint? No big deal, It's like, what's the problem here? It's like, why do we have to make it an either or? Michael Dames, the great mythographer in England, has written about the both and thinking. Learning how to hold complexity and not think, I got to make a choice. It's got to be either pagan or Christian. Can't do both. You can, that's what this should be about, is learning how to allow space for change and for ambiguity and complexity. We can't just kind of get it all right and hold it that way, or we've gone away from life. Life in nature is flux and flow. It used to be called mutability in the Middle Ages. Oh, someone else. I'm sure there are other. Where'd the microphone go? I'd say shout, but we got to get this down.
Yes, it's just a simple question. What is the website of the Black Earth Institute?
Oh, it's easy. blackearthinstitute.org.
.org. And can you be part of this if you are a poet and not a scientist?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They're all artists working on intersections of other disciplines.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
do look at it. The website is just going live. There's mistakes on the website right now. They'll be corrected this week. Thanks for
Thank you.
asking. Oh, there's somebody right next to you.
There are many many artistic activities which you will find that moving from order to order is through a phase transition of chaos is a very, very nice thing. If you know Dave Brubeck, jazz, which is an improvisational music, it's a dance put into improvisation. He goes through time phase transitions. If you know Take Five, most people have probably heard that. He composed purposefully, actually knowingly, that bifurcations, when you go into rhythm changes, shifting one to the other, order to order, and it gives a strange energy. When it goes through strange energy. I used to put fractals when I made presentations for business people on the screen before the presentation. The amazing attraction, strange attraction, they talk about it, feel about it, and the whole meeting is quite different. And here comes, which is, I think, far more important. I found that saying, Jesus is saying, if 2 and 3 comes together, I will be in the midst of you. And we experience this during dialogues, that the number 12 is not an arbitrary number. The Santa Fe Institute you mentioned, probably you read some about what the importance is of some numbers. When there are 12 people coming together, there is a strange flow of dialogue. It goes through a very dynamic, at times crisis, like phase transitions. And if it happens to hit right, based on the facilitator, then something new emerges, something which really delightful to take part. So I think the research of this kind in many fields is not just well justified, just about demanded.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you that this is a world in which we see increasing clinging to certain visions and inflexibility. And new visions will not come from that kind of rigid holding on. It will come from the phase transition. One can only hope we don't have the catastrophic breakdown first. I want to mention the book by John Briggs and David Peat called 7 Life Lessons of Chaos, that has a gorgeous chapter on the butterfly effect in terms of politics, that you don't necessarily have to have huge amounts of money, people, and so forth to begin to affect change. It's a really hopeful chapter, a little like the algae experiment, that change doesn't come from having all the power and, willing it that way and cutting things off. Change comes, well, either from a catastrophic breakdown and the need for a reemergent order, or because people become flexible. Even in our own lives, we know if we just, I can't give up this job, I'm too linked in with it, well, you'll get fired, trust me, if we don't give, life will help us give up. And learning how to just, say, okay, this is process. We're in process. We have to keep coming back to that rather than thinking, okay, now I've got it right. Now I've got my house clean. That dog can't come in. That's life. Life is the dog coming in the door. It's not us getting it right. I've become more forgiving toward myself as I think that I'm just a work in progress. I don't have to get it absolutely right every day. I once had a cartoon that said, it had showed somebody lying in bed saying, I can't decide whether to get up and do everything right or not get up at all. And I think that this emphasis on perfection often does thwart us in action. Like, I can't do that because I can't do it perfectly. We don't live in a world of amateurs anymore. Why should we dance when we can turn on MTV? Why should we sing with our friends when we can turn on a CD? But the professionalization of so much has meant that we're not involved with each other. We dance not to be perfect, but to be with each other. We sing in chorus, not because we've got the best voice and can get a CD contract, but to join our voices with our friends. Still in Ireland, there's a lot of community arts, And I just brought students over, and we were in residence at a small town of 3 blocks long in the west of Ireland during an arts festival. And they were just amazed at how people would like get up and sing in the bar, even if it was not a good rendition. Everybody was kind of participating. We've lost that. Amateur has in it amo, love. I'm doing it for the love of it, not because I'm a professional. And as a result, we've gotten much more invested in product. So when we see Madonna, who's really quite a fabulous performer, we see her thing that she's practiced, and she's doing it again. It's like we're seeing her live doing what we could see on TV. That's not really what the arts were about. The arts were joining our community together. To go to a ceilidh dance where old people are dancing with teenagers is really lightens my heart, because it's not all about everybody doing it perfectly. And I'd like to see more amateurism. At the same time, I'm afflicted by the typical, American sense that if I can't do it really well, I shouldn't even start. So I have to struggle with that inside as well. I see somebody over there, Betty.
I don't know if it'll cheer you up or not, but we have a graduate program that has one of his theoretical constructs, chaos theory. It's fabulous. This is I'm a social work professor, so I have to say that there's nothing that cheers you more than thinking about chaos and helping people. And to have a graduate program whose design it is to be helpful, coming out as social workers, it's nice to think that we're not perfect, and they ought to learn not to be perfect too.
That's tremendously inspiring. Yep. That's really neat to hear. Are there classes? Or?
It's the title. Chaos theory is one of the theoretical constructs for the program itself. So
that warms my heart.
Yes.
That's marvelous. And that's where? Tell us all.
Wichita State University in Kansas.
That's wonderful.
Wichita State University in Kansas.
Oh.
I just want to share something that I came across a number of years ago, which kind of pertains to what you were just saying in terms of the arts, and just everything has gotten very professional, and we're exposed to so many professionals in their creation. What this does, it causes us to compare ourselves to the best of others instead of considering the best of ourselves. And that kind of makes us feel inadequate. And I think I found that really quite profound, because that's kind of what I found myself doing. I'm a creative professional. And so I just wanted to share that, because I think that we really need to look at ourselves and the best that we can do instead of comparing what we do to the best of what other people can do.
That's very well stated. And even outside the arts, I mean, we have this whole kind of professionalism in general, like, people who won't decorate their homes or plant their yards because they'll do it wrong. So increasing professionalism of everything. And that, of course, keeps some people employed as, say, garden designers, which is not a bad profession. But to start not from, I'd like to really, work with somebody and do it well, but I just don't even want to try because I'll do it wrong. I'll compare myself to the people on TV, and I'll do it wrong. There's a lot of this comparison on TV right now. I mean, if you think of all of the reality shows in which, people get voted off various things, they did it wrong, now they're gone, What a paradigm, not exactly community building, is it? I occasionally catch one of those, and of course I'm always imagining myself being voted off. I mean, I'm never imagining myself winning in those things. I was like, I'd lose. I don't even want to watch this. It's too painful. But when we compare ourselves to the products of commerce as our only way of seeing ourselves, well, we lose a lot. People don't want to cook because they'll do it wrong, and we're losing constantly. This is, a capitalist plot. If you read Marx, which I did a few years ago while I was working on The Red-Haired Girl, I wanted to understand the basis of the words related to cow, and this led me to reading Marx. Cattle and capitalism turn out to be related etymologically. One day at a garage sale, I told you I digress. One day at a garage sale, I found an Oxford English Dictionary for $5, and I've never been the same. I keep looking up where the words come from, and it leads me in all sorts of realizations about things, because if you look at where the actual words come from, wow, it's really powerful. But there's a famous incident here, which is in Scotland in the 1800s. Everybody made their own boots, and they were just kind of, your boots wore out, you just cut them out of hide and sewed them together and made your own boots. It was like everybody made boots. And then there was a concerted campaign to say you had to have heels on your boots. Well, that couldn't be done at home. And within a generation, nobody knew how to make boots. I think that's kind of a metaphor for all the losses that we don't know how to knit, and we don't know how, all those little crafts and so forth. I believe Martha Stewart is a, kind of crypto-pagan, like if we all lived like Martha Stewart, we'd be like constantly in the flow of the year, decorating our houses. I mean, read her carefully. What's she about? And we'd be doing things, we'd be risking, and that's part of it. If you're going to make your own cupcakes, sometimes they will suck, I mean, they won't necessarily always be at the level of perfection, but because we have this idea of consistency, this also means we have kind of a lot of mediocrity, because at least we know it's going to be the same. It's not going to be, some good cupcakes and some bad. They'll always taste the same. What's that about?
Hi. What's interesting to me is I was thinking about the idea of perfectionism, and I'm a therapist, so ignore me. Yep. I think it's interesting because what I've learned in my profession is perfectionism is about hiding shame.
Oh, interesting.
And shame, if we have, we teach that there's two kinds of shame, but real shame says I'm human, and I make mistakes, I have limits, and that's okay. And I know in my own journey that when I learned that I learned to be free and okay with the mistakes, and it doesn't matter anymore. It's just okay to be out there and be who I am and do what I do, and if it doesn't turn out, so be it. And I find that the majority of people who walk through our doors for treatment are so into perfectionism. And I think what lies behind the perfectionism is the fear of being found out.
Fascinating.
So I thought that was really interesting. And I also have a degree in language and linguistics. So as you mentioned, amo means love in amateur. Ama also means soul. And so I worked at a treatment center, and we really push spirituality a lot, because we found that if people found spirituality, they found healing. And one of the ladies that was a grief and spiritual counselor out there that I just admired and loved talked about, to her, spirituality was connection with other souls. And so when you said amateur, I thought of that, and I thought, wow, I like that.
Oh, I like that too.
And of course it includes love.
A friend of mine is in the midst of finishing a movie called 50 at 50. When she turned 50, she decided that she would do 50 new things during that year, things that she had never done. And she filmed herself doing these. These involved things like shaving all her hair off. That was pretty extreme. She's one of those people that can actually look good with a bald head. But she did things like she was a Santa in a mall at Christmas, and she took a lesson in the harp, and she skateboarded, and she sold hot dogs at Wrigley Field, and it got more and more inventive as the year went on, and she was looking for, well, what have I never done? She participated in a release of the soul with some Jewish friends at the end of the year, and all sorts of these experiences that she had. And what was interesting to her was how, at the age of 50, her sense was, okay, well, I am who I am, and that's kind of it. It's kind of straight downhill from here. And she wanted to challenge that within herself. Her name's Etta Worthington, and the film's called 50 at 50. So look for it when it's out. She wanted to challenge that rigidity within herself, and she wanted to become childish again and make a fool of herself. Like do things that she didn't think she could do. So she went to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. She went to France and boated down the Seine. She did all sorts of exotic things, but she also did little homey things, like she tarred her roof. And all the time her daughter was like videoing her doing these things. I find that to be an extraordinarily powerful image for how we can reinvigorate our lives when we feel we're becoming, fearful and shameful. I think that's a very good combination. I think that might have been me. Where we feel like, okay, I've got to stay within my confines because I'll screw it up if I do anything here. I'm not gonna skateboard. I'll just fall down. Well, I mean, assuming you're not gonna like break things, falling down is not the worst thing. It's worse to hold yourself back in fear from life. And to learn to go out and be open is a constant, open-hearted too, is a constant struggle, I think, for most of us, that we get kind of safe. We get in our safe space and we don't want to challenge it. We don't want to screw it up. But like I say, keep feeling that way and you're likely to get confronted by challenges by life. Betty, you've got somebody up here.
I thought I'd share with you something that I have done. I've always been sort of a shy, introvert type person, but I also teach corporate students, adults. And one of the things that I started doing fairly early on was I reward students for finding my mistakes. I bring in bags of chocolate, small pieces of chocolate.
Oh, I love this.
And if they find a mistake in the material that I hand out, or if they tell me that I said something wrong, I will reward them publicly in the class. And it becomes very interesting to see how they respond. Some of them will come up quietly and say, I know you like to find mistakes in your books, so you can correct them. So here's one, but I don't want to announce it to the whole class. But then I'll announce it to the whole class afterwards. Oh, page such and such has a mistake, so-and-so found it for me, and here's his chocolate or her chocolate. So it's become very interesting. And I try to create an environment where they're allowed to make mistakes too, because in a corporation, people don't like it when you make mistakes. But I try to really encourage them to know that none of them can be perfect, but so they have to work together. And then they'll be less likely to make mistakes if they work together. So I'm always out there trying to find mistakes, and I really, really encourage them. I also have field trips. I teach computers, so I have them run over. If someone has made a really great mistake on their computer, if everyone come over and I say, look at this is just absolutely wonderful. I couldn't do this myself. This is phenomenal. I want you all to see this mistake. It is just so wonderful. And they all think I'm crazy, but it's a lot of fun, and it really reduces the fear of making mistakes. I have to say that I still am very terrified of making mistakes, but at least I'm trying to bring it out in the open and kind of solve it. So yeah, I just thought I'd share
And
that.
one of the important things you're doing too is bringing up that thing that it's as a group that we move forward, and one person can't be perfect. So that's a wonderful thing for them to realize. And how brave of you. I'm immediately thinking, would I dare? That's very, very brave.
It works. It doesn't. I thought it would be really stupid and I would get clobbered, but it works.
Very good.
I've been thinking about the drunk who finally hits bottom, and then he starts up. And I think our politics are somewhat like that. They're just about ready to hit bottom, and hopefully they'll start up.
Yeah, and it is that the part of the alcoholic process of hitting bottom is that clinging. I'm clinging to this one way I have of doing things. And sometimes it takes some really catastrophe for people to wake up. I'm very concerned about climate change because I come from Alaska and I've been, seeing glaciers I've known since childhood melting away. The impact at the poles is much greater than it is in the, quote, temperate zones. Although I'm not sure we can call this temperate anymore. But we may have reached a tipping point. Some of my friends at the Center for Global Climate Change at the University of Alaska think that it may be all over. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but James Lovelock has a new edition of Gaia out, which has an a new afterword, I understand, I've been told, but I haven't had a chance to read it myself, in which he says that, we are really in for catastrophic breakdown, and that the way we will survive, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, sorry about that, but the way we will survive culturally as humanity is through interpersonal connections, and particularly storytelling as a way of keeping our knowledge alive, because we can't necessarily count on, discs full of things that we can't read now because we don't have electricity. So we've got to learn how to tell ourselves the stories that we need to stay alive spiritually and culturally. Learn how to connect person to person, not through media. And I'm the biggest email junkie on the planet, so I don't want that to happen. But learning how to have those conversations and the dialogue, as you said, the person-to-person dialogue, that's got to be part of what we do to practice for the future. If Lovelock is correct, I'm giving a third-hand thing because I haven't actually read it myself. Go ahead.
The synchronicity of speaking about people working together reminds me that you were using a word before and that you like to look for where a word begins. The word amateur, the word amos. In Hebrew, the word means people. But it doesn't just mean, 4 people are standing or 10 people are standing in a spot. It refers to a nation of people working together. And here's that word and it's just pulling together everything that we're talking about.
That's lovely. In Yup'ik, Northern Eskimo, there are 2 plurals, and I think this is a 3-body problem. There's singular, and there's dual, and there's plural. Embedded in the language is the idea that people in groups are different than in pairs or singular. And we sort of start grammatically, we start plurality anytime there's more than one of me, then we're plural. But I love that idea that there's the pair and then there's the group. And what would that do to you if you spoke that way all the time? If you were constantly in your actual language talking in a different framework? Someone mentioned that this morning, and there are languages that do that.